10, and we won't finish today. Hebrews chapter 10. No surprise there, right? So last week as we looked at Hebrews chapter 10, we looked at kind of a conclusion in his thought process as whoever the author of Hebrews is. We don't know that for certain. But he, the author, has spent 9 chapters, 10 chapters proving his point. Just to see if you've been paying attention, what was his main point? Jesus is better. Better what? Better everything. But in specifics, but you're right, I give you that. Better sacrifice, better high priest, better king, better covenant. Jesus is better. Okay? In the context, which you know is one of my favorite words, context. These are first century Jewish Christians who are struggling in their faith. Struggling to the point where we're going to see next lesson in specifics how they were struggling. But they're struggling to the point where they're saying, I'm going to go back. Right? Now, we're not Jewish. We're not first century. But I believe if we've lived long enough, and maybe you don't have to live that long, but if you've lived long enough, you've come to the point or the position in your life where you think, is this really worth it? Life was a lot easier before. And we contemplate that thought that says, maybe I'll just quit. Maybe I'll just go back. And I think if we've lived long enough, we've all been there. So we can relate a little bit to what these Jewish believers first century were going through. Is this really worth it? And the author has spent these 9, 10 chapters saying, yes, it is. He's giving us stern warnings. Another quiz. What were some of the warnings that he gave us in Hebrews? Don't go backwards. Don't drift away. Chapter 2. How shall we escape if we neglect so great a salvation? And the answer, rhetorical, is you can't, you won't. What's another warning? Chapter 3. He uses the children of Israel in their wilderness wanderings, and he uses the phrase, they began to harden their hearts, which was a process. Although, reading about the children of Israel, quiz time, in the history of the nation of Israel, they go out of Egypt, which is the Exodus. They go to the Red Sea, pursued by Pharaoh's army. God miraculously opens the sea. They cross. They get into the wilderness. And when we think of the wilderness, it's not like the Bob Marshall. This is the wilderness of a desert. They get out into the desert and they begin to complain. Here's the question. How long did that take to happen?
When they started complaining?
Yep.
Immediately?
3 little days. They begin to complain to Moses, saying, wish we were back in Egypt, because we had food. Remember, leeks and onions and whatever, it's listed in there. And we had water to drink. You brought us out here into this desert and we're going to die. 3 days they're complaining. And that's profound because they just saw 10 plagues, miraculous plagues in Israel, or in Egypt. They just saw the Red Sea parted. They know God can do these miracles, and in 3 days they're done. Hopefully, we don't fall into that. And we're hard on the children of Israel, but we need to be hard on ourselves sometimes as well. Okay? Don't harden your hearts. What's another one he gave us in chapter 5? Remember what he says? You have become dull of hearing. It's not that you become deaf because of age or loud noises. It's because you've plugged your ears. Not going to listen anymore. Remember one time as a high school kid, 2 hours. But she talked to my dad, who then talked to me. Yeah. Not recommended. But that's the idea. I'm not going to listen. And he's clearly presenting logically the facts here. You can't argue with the facts, right? We talked last week, 2 weeks ago, chapter 10 is his closing arguments. The recapitulation where he says, this is how it is. Now last week he changes, middle of chapter 10, he changes and he gets very applicable, which means personal. And it's first century, but the application is profound. And I'll just go over them real briefly because it sets the stage for today's lesson. Okay? Verse 22, verse 23, and verse 24. And they all start the same way. What is it?
Let us.
Let us. It's inclusive. Important point. This is not some guy up in front saying, this is what you got to do. This is a guy saying, we're all in this together. We're going to do it together. Valuable point. Draw near, verse 22, with a true heart full of assurance of faith. And we're going to talk, as the lesson goes, not so much today, but as the chapter 11 is all about faith. And we're going to talk a lot about faith. But let's draw near, let's get close. Let's take what we've listened to, what we've heard, and draw near. Let's embrace it. Let's get together. Let's work together on this, okay? Verse 23, and I know I'm being quick. Hold fast the profession of our faith without wavering. It's interesting, Scripture, James, talks about faith blown about by every wind of doctrine, right? Anything that comes along, we go that direction. What's the anchor of our faith? And I use that word specifically. What's the anchor of our faith? It's referenced in chapter 6. Which hope we have as an anchor of the soul, both sure and steadfast, and which entereth within the veil. What's the anchor of our faith? God, Jesus Christ. Earl Wise, who most of us, or some of us know, said one time in discussion as he was here filling in for us, he said, I would rather have a weak faith in a strong plank than a strong faith in a weak plank. Just think about that. I use that in reference to crossing a creek, for saying, and it's on a board. Okay? If you see that thin Wibben-C board, oh, I can cross that. And I don't know if you've ever done it, but I've tried that, and usually what happens is you get wet, right? You'd rather have a weak faith in that strong plank, which is Jesus Christ. But that faith without wavering. And I have to mention the last part of verse 23 in parentheses, for he is faithful that promised. Is God good to his word? Yes. Absolutely, and always. Don't forget that. When your faith is wavering, it's no mistake. In the book of Psalms, especially, Jesus, or God, is described as what? A rock and a fortress, which symbolizes what? Stability and strength, impregnable. Jesus is that rock that is as good as his word. Verse 24, let us consider one another to provoke, not in a bad sense, but the order, and I ran out of time last week, so provoke unto love and then good works. And the order is specific. The order is very specific. What is love? Let's even go back to grammar. What's love? Noun, verb, adjective, adverb, what is it? What's that?
Yes.
It's both. It is both a noun and a verb, right? Okay? But let's use it as a verb. What's a verb?
Action.
Action. So here's action it produces. If I say to my wife, I've used this before, but if I say to my wife, which I do a lot, I love you. And that's where it ends. What is going to be her response? Well, she says, I love you too. But if there's never any action to back that up, is there room for doubt? Absolutely. You can measure love by the action it produces. And it says, provoke you unto love. When Jesus leaves his disciples back in the Gospel of John, he says, by this shall all men know that you are my disciples, by your good works. What's he saying? If you love one another. In the next chapter in the Gospel of John, he tells the disciples, if you love me, keep my commandments, which means obey. So if this order in Hebrews, if this would have said, and provoke one another unto good works, without love, what do we get? Just ritualistic works, right? There's no motivation behind them. And motivation is a good topic. I won't dwell on it today. But you think, what motivates you to do something? That's why when Jesus asked the disciples, if you love me, obey. What motivates you? What moves you to do something? Think that. He gives a specific example, verse 25. Not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as the manner of some is. What do we call that? Go to church. We associate church with a building. The church is people. Was that a dilemma that this first century church was dealing with? Evidently, if it wasn't, he wouldn't have put it in there. Is it a dilemma 21 or 21 centuries later? Absolutely. Is it still a command? Absolutely. It hasn't changed. Hasn't been deleted. Is church important? How? And I'll let, he said, but I want you to answer that. How important is church to me? And I've asked this question before, and we've had a great discussion. What brought you to church this morning? You think about that. And I said, if you're a kid, sure, mom and dad, right? Which is a viable answer, by the way. But if you're of age to make your own decisions, what brought you to church? Looks like it's going to be a nice day. Are there things you might rather be doing? Answer that carefully. Like when we were in the woods several years ago, we were having a discussion. It was hunting season, and it was a Christian crew, and they said, so is it better to just go hunting on opening day? This is when it started on Sundays. It starts on Saturdays now. Is it better to just go hunting on opening day or to sit in church and wish you were hunting? Right? Is that a dilemma? That's a dilemma. I've been in that dilemma. Especially when it snows on opening day, thinking, I know they're up there killing those elk that I shouldn't be killing. Right? Maybe that's not you, but that's me and some of us. But what brings you to church? You can answer that. Is there, and I actually have in my notes, how many options did they have in the first century going to church? Did they have the Baptist church and the Lutheran church? What did they have? The church. So here's my question.
But it was Baptist.
It was Baptist. Okay? We know where John's at. But how do we choose? How do you choose which church you want to attend? Okay, one that preaches the Word of God. What else?
One that the Spirit leads you to.
Okay, Spirit-led, Spirit direction. Okay, what else? These are all personal answers. That's what I want. I want you to think. Don't. I would say, don't always believe what the pastor's saying. Now that's maybe too far. But I want you to think. We have options. We have choices. And good answers in our Constitution. And we've talked about this in years past, but the very first point in our doctrinal statement is what? Maybe you need to read our doctrinal statement. What is it? I heard it. The Bible is our sole authority for faith and practice. Why is that first? Because it is the most important one. How do you choose which church you want to go to? One that preaches the Word. One that follows the New Testament guideline for what a church is. Okay? Into that one. Exhorting one another, and so much the more as you see the day approaching. The implication here in the end of verse 25 is, as the day approaches, which is the return of the Lord, there's going to be a falling away. And that word in the Greek is called what? John?
I'm trying to think what it is, but it means apostasy.
That's what it is. That's the Greek word, is apostasy, which means a great falling away. Is that going to happen? 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. It's prophetically announced. There's going to be a great falling away. Okay. I'll get off this and go to today's lesson, which I'll never finish. But know what you believe. Act upon what you know. Because we've looked at stern, harsh warnings. This one here that's coming up is the harshest one of all so far. Here it is. Verse 26. And this is in light of everything that we talked about. 4. If we sin willfully, after that we have received the knowledge of the truth, which is what the 9 chapters have just talked about. Is he clearly explained the knowledge of the truth? Absolutely. Without question, without doubt. If we sin willfully, after receiving the knowledge of the truth, there remaineth no more sacrifice for sins. How would you paraphrase that? Go ahead. You got an idea, I know.
It reminds me of that verse in Proverbs, that he who knoweth to do good and doeth it not, to him it is sin.
Okay? Exactly the same idea. You have the truth. You have the knowledge of the truth, which knowledge simply means that information, those facts that have been given to you. They're there. You can't refute them. The key word is willfully, which means what? It's intentional. It means I'm not going to listen. I know it's the truth. I know it's the right way. But I'm going, and I'll paraphrase it, I'm going to willfully choose to disobey. I'm going to reject the truth. And what's your option?
It's not going to be forgiveness.
Judgment. There's no more sacrifice for sins. So when you take that verse, and we're going to explain it more because the thought moves forward, but when you listen to people who say, oh, I'm going to get to heaven by being a good person, or I'm going to get to heaven by this and this and this. If, and I'm not saying this, I'm reading it, if you reject the sacrifice that Jesus paid for you, you have no hope. None. But you have something to look forward to. Here's what it is. Verse 27. but a certain and fearful looking for of judgment and fiery indignation, which shall devour the adversaries. Now that's not something to look forward to, but that's what's going to happen. See if you can remember. If you can't, you can look it up. Verse 27, chapter 9 says what? It's appointed unto man, wants to die, and after this, the judgment. Here's the judgment. Okay, I don't necessarily like teaching in these verses because they're harsh, but they're there for a reason. Is fear a motivator? Absolutely. You reject the ministry, the atonement, the sacrifice of Jesus made for you. You have no more sacrifice for sins. You wait the judgment of God. God won't send anybody to hell. You better wake up. I had that argument. God doesn't send anybody to hell. And you make that choice. But if you read Revelation chapter 21, which is the great white throne, and it says, I saw the dead, small and great, stand before God. And every man was judged out of the books, according to his works. And death and hell were, you know what King James says, the next word? Cast, which means what? Thrown. Sent. Death and hell were cast into the lake of fire. God won't send anybody to hell. It's not what it says. You ever heard a good hellfire and damnation message? Did you sweat? I heard some at Bible college. Monroe Parker. Take the elevator of your imagination and we're going to go down into hell and we're going to interview people. And you were sweating by the time he was done. Like, whew. Go to Luke 16 when the rich man and Lazarus, and the rich man is in hell and he's tormented, and he says to Abraham, what? The best evangelists are in hell, by the way. Go back and tell my 5 brothers they don't want to come here. I'm here, and I don't want them here. Hell is for real, and hell is a place, and you only have 2 options. Matthew chapter 12, verse 30. Jesus speaking says, he that isn't for me is against me. Which means what? You can't straddle the line. Or it's a better picture, straddle that barbed wire fence. You got to be on one side or the other. Certain, fearful, looking for judgment. The word fearful, and we're going to see in verse 31 the same thing. It means terrified. You ever been terrified where you can't move or speak? That's what he says. And fiery indignation. Deliberate judgment. Who's our judge? God is. And there's prepared a place, it says in Revelation, for the devil and his angels, the devil and his demons, but it's a place where a lot of people are going to end up. Which shall devour, which means to utterly consume all his adversaries. You're not going to get a chance to even argue with God. Judgment will be, and it's going to be illustrated. Verse 28. He that despised or willfully broke Moses' law, and we'll read a verse here in Numbers in just a second, died without mercy under 2 or 3 witnesses. Go to Numbers. Let me find my glasses so I can read here. I think it's Numbers 15. Verse 30. But the soul, the individual that doeth aught, commits sin, and the word is presumptuously. What's that mean? And I'll give you the context. In the preceding verses, he's talking about who sins ignorantly versus one who sins presumptuously. So what's presumptuous?
Sinning intentionally, thinking 1 John 9 applies.
Yeah.
All I gotta do is say, oh God, I'm sorry.
Grace abounds. Romans 6, right? It means you're making that intentional choice, and we're going to come to more of this in chapter 12, but we're a ways away. Okay? I'll read Numbers 12. But the soul that doeth aught sins presumptuously, whether he be born in the land, Jewish, or a stranger, non-Jewish, the same reproacheth the Lord. That soul shall be cut off from among his people, because he hath despised the word of the Lord, and hath broken his commandment. That soul shall be utterly cut off, his iniquity shall be upon him. Willfully, presumptuously, intentionally, you know the facts, you know the information, and you say no. I'm not going to do it. In Moses, 2 or 3 witnesses. 2 was enough, 3 was better. You had no defense, you had no excuse. Judgment was, it says, without mercy. Judgment was sure and swift. And they knew the penalty. Go to verse 29. Here's your 3 witnesses. How much sorer or worse punishment, suppose ye, think ye, shall be thought worthy of he, number 1, who hath trodden under the foot the Son of God. That's our first witness, the Son of God. Jesus Christ, our better high priest, our better sacrifice. Number 2, we'll explain these, I'll give them to you. And hath counted the blood of the covenant, the blood of the sacrifice, that's our second witness, an unholy thing, and hath done despite unto the Spirit of grace. That's our third witness. So you have all 3 of these. We're going to testify against you. What do you suppose will be his judgment? But let's look at the witnesses. Trodden underfoot. You get the vivid word image, the picture. You're going to step on something, which shows what? Contempt. I have no use for it. It's the idea of not just standing on something, but to stand on it and grind it up. Chew it into the ground. It's worthless to me. Dangerous position. Trodden underfoot, the Son of God. And you, at least, who would do such a thing? Number 2, and had counted the blood of the covenant wherewith he was sanctified, an unholy thing. He, the author of Hebrews, has spent all of chapter 9, a lot of chapter 8, talking about blood. Remember, hopefully, the comparison between the blood of bulls and of goats versus the blood of Jesus. And he makes that comparison back and forth. Just put it, if you were that Old Testament Jewish person bringing that sacrifice and it was blemished, crippled, what happened? It wasn't accepted. The priest didn't offer it for a sacrifice because they knew the requirements. It was defiled. And when you, as that willful sinner, presumptuous, says, I'm not going to accept the blood of the sacrifice, what are you saying about Jesus' blood? It's unholy. It's not sufficient. You just stepped on him. Now you're saying his blood isn't good enough for me. Or maybe I don't need it. That's a danger we all fall into. doesn't matter. It doesn't make a difference. You treat his blood as an unholy thing. It's unclean. It's not worthy. It's not sufficient. Dangerous position number 2. And hath done despite unto the Spirit of grace. Spite. Hate. When I think of spite, I think of spitting in somebody's face. And I'll be honest, I haven't had anybody intentionally spit in my face. And it will take a lot of grace for me not to punch that person. I'll be honest. But the picture is vivid. When you spit in somebody's face, what are you saying?
You're disgusting.
You're disgusting. You're not worthy. I'm not even going to listen to you. You're not worth my time. Here's your 3 witnesses. Die without mercy. Judgment is sure. How do you treat Jesus? And this, there's a whole lot more here to preach, ain't there? Who's Jesus Christ? Who is he to you? Go to Matthew chapter 16. Jesus asked that of his disciples, who do people say that I am? And they give some pretty good answers. Then he said, but who do you guys, who are you 12? Who do you say that I am? And Peter says, thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. Who is Jesus Christ to you? What does his atonement mean for you? Salvation is completely personal and individual. The Spirit, John chapter 3, Nicodemus, born of the water and born of the Spirit. And we use the verse out of context a little bit in Revelation chapter 3 in the church of Laodicea, but it's a picture of his church, where Jesus is standing outside the door of the church knocking, saying, let me in, it's my church. How come you got the door locked? But it's an application we use in salvation about our hearts sometimes. The Spirit of grace, that spirit of conviction. Do we open the door? In that illustration in the book of Revelation, the only doorknob is on the inside. He can't open the door and come in. We have to open that door and invite him in. And I don't know about you, but sometimes under the conviction of the Spirit, John referenced it in the paper. There's reference the week before about either you respond like Isaiah or you respond like Jonah. And you remember what their responses were? Isaiah. Here am I, send me, I'm going to open the door. Or what did Jonah do?
Ran.
And those are your 2 options. And we have a little cliche that says you can run, but you can't hide. So if God and the Spirit is knocking, what are you going to do? And having been in that situation a lot of times, at least my little brain says, not now. But what does that mean? What are you actually saying when you say not now? You're saying no. I'll do it later. You're saying no. Be careful. Verse 30, and I'm out of time, but this is all the same context. For we know him that hath said, this is a quote, Deuteronomy, vengeance belongeth unto me, I will recompense, or I will repay, saith the Lord. Again, the Lord shall judge his people. Vengeance is what? When we think of vengeance, we think of what? Revenge. Getting even. It's not a right It's not the best translation. It means judgment, justice will be meted out. God has given clear instructions. You can't question it. You can't say, I don't believe. Well, I guess you can say, I don't believe that. But it doesn't change the fact. God will judge his people with justice, which means fairly. The Lord shall judge his people, verse 31. It's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. And in our context, who's it referring to? That one who sinned willfully. Who said, no, I am not going to accept the sacrifice. No, I'm not going to believe. No, I'm going to go my own way. It's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. Judgment awaits. Where are you? It's interesting in this context, broad context of the book of Hebrews, this is not an evangelistic sermon. He is not preaching to a crowd of unsaved people. Who's he preaching to? The church. The church. Are there unsaved people in the church? Absolutely. So I was raised in church. Good. Be thankful. Be thankful for parents that brought you to church. But don't base your salvation on that. Salvation is not inherited. And you can sit in church a whole lifetime and hear the same sermons and the same truth and the same facts and still go to hell. In fact, I gotta quit it. I think we're going to be surprised when we're in heaven about who is in heaven and who isn't. I think it's going to surprise us. You going to heaven? How are you getting there? By grace through faith in the finished work, that finished sacrifice, that atonement that Jesus Christ made for us. Any other option, you're not getting there. Salvation serious? It's critical. Vital. Do you believe it? That's what he's saying. Here's the facts. Jury. What are you going to do? It's time for a decision. Do I believe? Next lesson, we're going to see some instances what was causing them to doubt. Oh, it's easy to believe when life's going my way. Right? But when some troubles bump in our way, what did I do to deserve this? Or my favorite one yet, life's not fair. That's not fair. Who cares?